All right, let's jump right into it. In this explainer, we're tackling one of the absolute most explosive what-if debates in basketball history. You know, the NBA has always been defined by its eras, right? The 80s had Magic and Bird, the 90s obviously had Jordan, the 2000s gave us Kobe and Duncan, and the modern era? Well, that's defined by guys like LeBron, Curry, and Nikola Jokić. But when diehard fans start fiercely debating what international crowds sometimes call the Acus Symbole NBA, which is basically the ultimate clash of the league's defining symbols across generations, there was one specific matchup everyone keeps coming right back to. The modern maestro going head-to-head against the brutal, physical 90s.
So just imagine this for a second. We are taking today's highly analytical pass-first center and dropping him straight into the meat grinder of the 1990s. And look, we aren't talking about today's spaced-out three-point heavy league. No way. We're talking about an era where hand-checking was practically a martial art, and driving into the paint literally felt like stepping into a war zone. What actually happens to a 7-foot finesse player when you rip him out of the analytics-driven modern game and throw him right into that incredibly hostile, physically punishing environment?
To really wrap our heads around this clash, we have to look at the sheer brute force of the 90s baseline versus the wide-open, analytical style that Jokić absolutely dominates today. I mean, the 90s simply weren't built for finesse. They were built for heavy, punishing contact. Defenders were allowed to just keep their hands on ball handlers, the games were so much slower, and you had these absolute titans ruling the paint. Guys like Ewing, Robinson, Hakeem, and Shaq. Every single possession took a real physical toll on you. Modern basketball? It's a completely different animal. It's a game of geometry, spacing, and hyper-efficiency.
Which brings us to the anomaly himself. Jokić doesn't overpower guys with explosive vertical leaps like your typical 90s giant. Actually, scratch that. He's less of a traditional player and honestly more like an entire offensive system just disguised as one guy in a jersey. At first glance, you'd probably think the 90s would eat him alive, right? Because he doesn't have Shaq's raw power or Robinson's vertical rim protection or Ewing's aggressive post-ups. But instead of jumping over you, he just controls the tempo completely. He manipulates defenders with a simple glance and sees passing lanes before they even exist on the court. You always hear that saying that while traditional centers were locked in sheer physical warfare, he's literally out there playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. And it's spot on. People's knee-jerk reaction is to question if he could survive the sheer physicality of the 90s, but that entirely assumes he'd play their game, and he absolutely wouldn't. He leans into intellect over pure athleticism, manipulating the defense with a level of vision and timing we've rarely ever seen. So really, what we're looking at is a battle of brute force versus leverage. Back in the 90s, big men were trained to just bulldoze weaker players right out of the way. It was a 48-minute wrestling match for positioning, where guys would aggressively shove you off your spots. But Jokić, he uses his body almost like a martial artist. He doesn't try to overpower you, he absorbs your energy and redirects it. Because his whole game is built on anticipation rather than explosive speed, the heavy, constant physical contact of the 90s might actually give him a bizarre advantage. He knows exactly where you are leaning, and he uses your own force right against you.
And here's something crucial to remember about 90s defenses. The rotations were notably slower, meaning he'd have an absolute eternity to systematically pick teams apart. If you watch how he processes the game in real time, he recognizes the double team before the defender has even fully committed to it. So before the pressure actually gets there, the ball is already out of his hands. He's completely exploiting that slower help defense. Now that kind of elite processing speed translates to literally any era. But in the 90s, the defensive pacing back then would give him a massive, wide open window to operate.
Now, historically speaking, we've seen passing bigs like Bill Walton or Arvydas Sabonis thrive down low. But Jokić is just a completely different beast. In the 90s, he'd be stationed primarily in the low post, sure, but his vision extends across the entire floor. The very millisecond he fires a cross-court skip pass or hits a baseline cutter under pressure, it forces a late defensive rotation. And let me tell you, in the 90s, a late rotation was basically a death sentence. It meant you're giving up an uncontested mid-range jumper or a wide-open layup. He literally generates his offense by breaking the other team's physical structure. But okay, let's pause, because here is a perfectly fair pushback that critics always bring up with this matchup. The 90s did not have floor spacing bigs. Teams would routinely just sag off non-shooters and pack the paint with 5 massive bodies, basically daring you to shoot. And look, Jokić isn't Steph Curry. He's not going to be out there bombing 15 threes a game to pull those giants out to the perimeter. So how exactly does he navigate a completely clogged, brutally physical 90s paint? Well, his ultimate counterattack isn't actually his shooting, it's reaction time. Any delayed adjustment by a rigid 90s defense suddenly becomes his personal playground. If they sag off to clog the paint, boom, he instantly turns into a deadly playmaker from the top of the key, running the whole offense like a 7-foot point guard. But if they step up to pressure him, he just slips right into the paint or threads the needle to a cutter. The natural delay built into those 90s defensive systems becomes his ultimate weapon. Think about how he'd strategically counter the absolute legends of that decade. He's not going to try to outmuscle Shaquille O'Neal inside, right? No, he'd pull Shaq out into open space and just exhaust him on the perimeter. Against Hakeem Olajuwon's flawless footwork, he wouldn't try to isolate him, he'd test the entire team's defensive cohesion instead of getting dragged into a grueling one-on-one duel. And against Patrick Ewing's fierce rim protection, he'd force him into really uncomfortable, perimeter-oriented playmaking. See, Jokić doesn't try to beat the individual, he beats the system. Now, because the 90s game was so much slower with way fewer possessions, his raw scoring numbers might actually drop to something like 18 to 22 points a night. But do not let those numbers fool you. Instead of the flashy 30-point triple-doubles we regularly see today, he'd be trading pure volume for absolute, ruthless efficiency. He'd pair those points with unprecedented massive assist numbers for a center in that decade, just completely dictating the flow of the entire game. It's a really fascinating paradox when you think about it. A slower, grittier game actually heavily benefits a high IQ player. With far fewer possessions per game in the 90s, the weight of every single decision is magnified. Every single mistake a defense makes becomes incredibly costly. In an environment where total control matters way more than sheer speed, the entire offense would run through him more completely than almost any center in NBA history. Every brilliant read he makes becomes infinitely more valuable. All right, but we definitely have to address the elephant in the room here, his defense. Wouldn't the elite physical scorers of the 90s just relentlessly target his lack of lateral quickness and elite rim protection? I mean, it's the #1 question surrounding his game even today. And for sure in the 90s, they'd absolutely test that weakness through punishing isolation post-ups and driving straight into his chest over and over again. But here is the major plot twist. The 90s might actually cover up his defensive flaws way better than the modern NBA does. Today's switch-heavy offenses are constantly trying to drag slower big men out to the perimeter, right? They want to isolate them on an island. Well, the 90s rarely did that. Instead, they built these tight, protective team shells around their big men in the paint, relying heavily on zone protective principles. So ironically enough, his team's defensive structure back then would probably offer him significantly more protection than the wide-open, spread-out spacing he deals with today. Ultimately, his absolute greatest weapon in the 90s wouldn't even be his scoring. It would be the sheer panic he induces. Historically, you double-team a massive center to stop him from scoring. But with Jokić, 90s teams would be forced to double-team him just to stop him from passing. Let that sink in. And the exact moment you do that, you've completely broken your own defense, generating wide-open shots everywhere for his teammates. He literally takes the established rules of both basketball eras and just bends them to his will. So, as we wrap up this explainer, it turns out we've kind of been asking the wrong question this whole time. The real debate isn't whether this unpredictable big man could survive the physical bruising 90s. The real question is whether the 90s could survive him. He isn't the fastest, he isn't the most athletic, and he isn't the strongest, but he is custom built to break the very structure of basketball. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to take away. If you drop a player who completely shatters all structural norms straight into the most rigid era in history, how many games would it take before the entire league had to literally change its rules just to stop him?